Himanshu and me together speaking on this, and I'm supposed to be talking about conceptual aspects of dignity and speaking with Professor Mahajan as the chair. I'm not only feeling nervous, but I'm also finding it a bit comical. But anyway, thank you very much, Sudhir, for asking me to speak on this and try to think conceptually. Not that I don't think conceptually, but I've been very kind of, ardent advocate of empirics and not taking theory seriously. So somebody like me trying to speak on theoretical issue is a rather kind of, what one should say, comical is perhaps the wrong word, but still let me try. Given that I'm a sociologist, so I'll also try to take you away from what one would call as dignity in political science to something like, sociological processes. First point, perhaps that has already been made in the morning session. I was not here because of some reason. Dignity obviously is a normative term. It's not something which is something out there that you can describe empirically. So, as a normative term, it is also located historically. It comes to us at some level as a normative category with the emergence of what one would call as constitutional democracies. So it is a term of the modern West, and it is in that context that dignity in some sense refers to an abstract notion of individual. The moment we think of dignity in the mainstream political science narrative, or most importantly, I think dignity has been talked about in legal narratives. Legally, it's a constitutional obligation to give dignity to every citizen of the country. And constitutional expert, people like Upendra Bakshi, have also written on this from a legal perspective and how dignity is aspect of what one would call as rights. All these are obviously narratives of the modern, narratives of the nation state, narratives of constitutional democracies, and all of them obviously come to us from the West. I would kind of try to argue against the idea that it only comes from the West. It also has its own kind of cultural contexts, and historically, if one was to go and look at Indian resources, whichever regional cultural context you think, you'll find lots of references on the idea of human dignity. Dignity is also a question in what one would call as bioethics, right? In medical sciences, human body has to have a dignity, and this is something that, again, in medical sciences, you can't ignore a question of dignity, even when a patient has to be, given treatment, operated upon. There is a question of dignity that becomes very critical. We do feel undignified when we have to go to hospital or, get a surgery done and we have to be completely unclothed. And that is a very can be mentally torturous experience. And then obviously philosophers have talked a lot about dignity. What do we mean by dignity when it becomes indignity? Likewise, if one was to identify another discipline where a question of dignity is very, very critical, actually perhaps the most critical question, and that is criminology. We don't talk about crime and science of crime. How do you treat an offender? How do you treat a person who is arrested by the police? Even if the person has committed rape or murdered somebody, what happens to his or her dignity? And these are very important, very significant moral questions, but they're also empirical questions. They're also policy questions. They're also procedural questions. So one can't really run away from these kind of questions. But how do we think of dignity from a sociological perspective? And I think when I think of sociological perspective, I also mean from a kind of social science perspective. And one needs to kind of think of it because if we have to deal with it empirically, then we need to isolate facts which are different from, say, questions of inequality in general. I mean, inequality could be of income, inequality could be of many other things. When do we talk about a particular kind of inequality as a question of dignity? So it is in that context that I think the idea of dignity or dignified individual has a specific historical context, which I was earlier referring to, and that is the modern West, where in some sense an individualized subject appears for the first time, or that's how it is presented to us. this whole idea of individual and individualism has been culturally in, say, for example, if one was to talk about Brahmanical Hinduism, there has been an idea of individual self in Brahmanical Hinduism, like Louis Dumas would talk about sannyas. When a person decides to take sannyas, he is generally a man who takes sannyas, has exercised his agency to at some level socially declare his death. And that is an agential individual who has been present in other cultures as well. So, but when we talk about dignified individual, and this is not simply an exception, this is a kind of general principle where everyone is a dignified individual. Everyone has to be, in some sense, a candidate for that kind of dignity, or has to be normatively considered as an individual who has right to be dignified. So it's obviously a historical construct, but that historical construct also has its own historical context, and that context, as I've been saying earlier, is the modern West, where you have the emergence of a modern nation state grounded in a notion of constitutional democracy, which again comes to us in the post the French Revolution, post-industrial revolution, post-enlightenment context. And that's why, in some sense, this whole idea of dignified individual is also an urban idea. It's also urban individualism, and that becomes very critical because the subject in which, the context in which we are talking about. In development discourse also, the question of dignity has acquired a kind of centrality after Amartya Sen's work, when he is talking not only about entitlements, but also the responsibility of welfare state, if one was to use the word welfare here, to ensure that every individual has the ability to appear in public without shame, right? Not feeling shame. That is the life of a dignified individual. And I think that becomes a very, very critical point for us when we are talking in relation to the rural, or in relation to the agrarian, or in relation to, at some level, also Himanshu is sitting here, so we can't escape economics, and economics is very central, as the keynote speaker was earlier speaking about developmental processes, and where, how does one operationalize dignity? Does it simply mean providing people employment? Does it simply mean providing people healthcare and housing? Or there is something more to it? And I think there is much more to it, and that's where I think the idea of dignity becomes very, very critical. But at the same time, if one was to kind of progress sociologically, one will also need to kind of move away from these normative contexts and normative concerns to thinking of dignity as something which is empirically describable. When do we think of dignity as a variable, and how do we operationalize dignity as a variable? So if you look at sociological canons, there is no direct engagement. I mean, we don't teach dignity as a concept in sociology classrooms, or I don't think there is much sociological research which we can call as dignity studies in sociology. But that doesn't mean that dignity is not part of everyday life, because as a word, if we are using it as a developmental category, it's become significant. If it is there in legal narratives, in crime narratives, in political science, then obviously it has a relational kind of context. And the moment we think about relationality, I think that's when we can move towards identifying the empirically describable kind of attributes of dignity, and that's where I think sociologists or sociological canons become very useful. So, to put it differently, how does one think of dignity as an aspect of social structure? That if dignity is a relational process, dignity is not something that is there in constitution and somebody promises to provide you, but it is also in everyday life. How do we deal with each other? How do we grow up as individuals? What kind of values we acquire when we are growing up? What kind of identities we acquire when we are growing up? And that's not difficult to kind of, speculate. And from dignity, one can easily move to the idea of status, right? In sociology, particularly in Weberian sociology, the idea of status is very central. And status is about, at some level, dignity. But when sociologists would talk about status, they would not put individual at the center. The idea of status is always identified with what we call as ascription, and ascription is by definition a communitarian. And when we think about ascription as being communitarian, then one obviously thinks of ascription in relation to, say, if we have to talk about India, we have to think about hierarchical structures. And these hierarchical structures are not simply structures of inequality, the point I was making earlier. They are also structures of ascription. And those ascriptions at some level invoke the idea of dignity in a negative sense. And I think if one was to look at the work that some of us have done, including earlier scholars in political science, one can easily invoke the notion of humiliation, right? So if one is talking about dignity, at some level one can think of dignity as the opposite of humiliation. So when I kind of invoke the idea of humiliation, again, I don't use it as a normative category in the sense in which somebody like Gopal Guru would do. I would say that caste is a structure of institutionalized humiliation. And here one is invoking the idea of humiliation against the idea people like, Louis Dumont would talk about hierarchy as a kind of a structure of inequality which is religiously reproduced. But I move that in my work to a structure of institutionalized humiliation. And the moment we use the word humiliation, we obviously are using humiliation in a slightly more sophisticated manner for what one would call as violence. So humiliation is always violence. Humiliation, wherever it happens, whether it is in a prison or it is at home in relation to a small kid, patriarchal structures, or it is in relation to women when a women experiencing menstrual cycle is asked to stay outside kitchen or outside the house for a few days. These are all structures that institutionalize violence. And this is normative at one level, but it is also descriptive. It is also something that empirically happens, and it doesn't happen to everyone. It is not an individual phenomenon. It is a categorical phenomenon in the sense that it's only the Dalit who experiences humiliation. It is the person who is untouchable experiences humiliation, or in patriarchal cultures, it would be the child or the women who are likely to be humiliated. So societies are hierarchical, and it is not exceptionally Indian, right? I'm not saying that this is the Indian view of humiliation or dignity. It's also, when Weber is talking about status as a dimension of power, it's obviously aspect of power as it functions in everyday life, as it functions in relational structure. So humiliation is produced by hierarchical structures, and hierarchy in Weberian sociology again has two different meanings. One is instrumental hierarchy. For example, we have this university where there is a hierarchical structure. We have vice chancellor, we have registrar, we have deputy registrar, we have assistant registrar. So that is instrumental hierarchy, which is based on rational organization principle. But as I was talking about earlier, hierarchy can also be cultural. Hierarchy can also be institutionalized humiliation, and caste is one of the obvious example of it. But race is also humiliation. Gender is also institutionalized hierarchy and humiliation, and a kind of aspect of violence. But at a broader level, I think the idea of inequality becomes very, very central. Again, we need to then rethink inequality. Again, Himanshu and I keep taunting each other, and Himanshu thinks, economy encompasses everything. If you give money to people, it takes care of all kinds of inequality. And I said, yeah, that's the problem with economics. That's not the problem with inequality per se. So inequality as a term is very useful, and I think we should invoke the idea of inequality. And economic disparities do become very critical aspect of inequality. But idea of inequality as a relationship then would also invoke questions of dignity, humiliation, hierarchy, and various other aspects of one would call as ascription. I think ascription is something that we don't really talk about much, again, because of the manner in which social sciences have emerged, the manner in which we have institutionalized them in our disciplinary systems. We always think of ascription as something which is either in the past or it is elsewhere. It is not in University of Jawaharlal Nehru University. It would either be in the village, or it was in India in the past, and now, or the West would think about it again in spatial temporal terms. Ascription is something that might be there in India, but not in London. But the moment you go to any Western city, I think you encounter ascription as soon as you land there. If your eyes are open, it depends on how you wish to see the world. So in some sense, sociological perspective help us move away from this idea of abstract individual, a right-bearing individual, a normative constitutional democracy, to a kind of sociological process of identity making. And I think that's the third category or fourth category that I want to invoke, that apart from hierarchy and ascription, these are also questions of identity. So once we acquire identity of being something, or identity is a processual thing, identity is not a fixed thing. So identity, obviously as individuals we have identity, but individual is not a psychological attribute. Individual is also a sociological product. It's also something that one would call a socio-psychological process through which we at some level become individuals of certain kind, and those individuals have identities, and those identities become meaningful only when they are socially agreed upon. If it is socially not agreed upon, you don't become a woman or a man, you don't become a Dalit or Swarna or something else that you want to talk about, or your skin color does not necessarily mean what racial category you come from. I could have this kind of skin and I could be classified either black or white depending on where I'm located in that society. Even a black person can be identified as not black and depends. So the point I'm trying to make is that identities are always socially constructed. They're always culturally produced. They're always historically, in some sense, produced over a long period of time, and they are sociologically identifiable, describable. So one needs to look at ascription from a non-evolutionist perspective, where ascription is not a moment of tradition. We were talking about binaries. So this whole binary between ascription versus achievement, that modern societies are in some sense individual consumers or individual income holders, or class specific differences between people who earn $2 in a day, they are poor. If you earn more than $2, you become middle class. If you earn $2 million in a day, you become rich or super rich. So that is not the way one thinks of inequality. That's not the way one can think about identities and ascription. And if one has to look at identity and ascription, they also need to be seen as being reproduced right in front of us. So the modern is not free from ascription, and therefore modern is not free from indignity. And that's why I think constitutional democracies very rightly make it as a normative question. I'll take another 5 minutes or so. So this is where the question of, if this was the broad framework, how does one then operationalize the idea of dignity in relation to the rural and in relation to the welfare state or agrarian? So, one way of talking about our contemporary times is to invoke the idea of neoliberal capitalism. I think there is something specific about neoliberal capitalism which is different from earlier capitalism or welfare state versus liberal state. So there is different. So what we have seen in last 25 years is accentuation of inequalities. And again, this inequality is obviously, in economic terms, we have seen the emergence of a new kind of wealth elite, or what we call as plutocracy. And this is something that was not even earlier quantified, right? It's only after, I think, Piketty's work that people started talking about 1% versus 90%, or you have the listing of big wealthy people. It wasn't there earlier until like 10 years back. When was the Hurun list first published? I think 10, 12 years back. So we didn't have list of wealthy people. And now, yesterday I was reading that India has the third largest number of dollar billionaires after US and China. And India obviously continues to be a very, very unequal country, and people who don't even have dignified living, a house and healthcare, their number is very, very large. So neoliberal capitalism is not simply producing inequalities of wealth and income, it is also reproducing forms of ascription. And these are not necessarily traditional forms of ascription. These could also be newer forms of ascription. I'll give you some example. One of them is spatiality, right? We think of rural and urban, again, in binary evolutionary terms, but that doesn't really help us. That doesn't take us very far. Again, my own work, I've shown that we may keep thinking, speculating, and maybe correctly that by 2030 or 2050 or by the end of this century, India would be largely urban or 70-75% urban. That might happen. But if we were to look at the history of last 100 and 150 years, the world has more people, absolute number of people living in rural areas is larger than ever before. And this is something that I support with my data in my book, and I've also been talking about it. The number of people living in urban areas is very large. It has grown up by many folds in India, but the number of people living in rural areas has not declined. It has actually grown by some 3 or 4 times if you were to compare, say, 1901 data to 2011 data. Absolute size of villages, number of villages has not declined in India. Despite many villages becoming census town, India has more villages in 2011 than it had in 2001, than it had in 1901. So number of rural settlements has been growing. So rural is not going anywhere. And this point that Sudhir was making earlier in the discussion, the trajectories of urbanization are culture context specific. The West became urbanized because of certain historical reasons, colonial plunder and stuff like that. But West also has rural imagination. West also has its villages and still talk about its farms, and they don't use the word peasant any longer. The language has changed, but we don't have peasant in that sense in India as well. So agrarian continues to be very large, but it's also very small. So agrarian continues to be the largest sector of employment, but in terms of its contribution to the national income, it has become much smaller. So thinking in ascriptive terms, thinking in sociological terms, spatiality has also acquired a new kind of, what one should say, meanings, new kind of ascription, that when we think about rural, we know, I remember growing up in Northwest India, in Punjab and Haryana when we were young kids. So if you are a landowner's son, if you are from a village, you had a sense of pride about yourself. When you went to the university, everyone wanted to identify themselves by referring to some village, and there were some people who had no village. They were always urban, and they always kind of felt marginalized in that context. And if you look at last 30 years, even in states like Punjab, where agriculture continues to be far more prosperous than in other states of India, being a villager is not seen as necessarily as a positive sign. And this is not something which is simply question of self-identification. It is very closely tied to the opportunity structure that neoliberal economy has produced. And in this opportunity structure, mobility processes are culturally structured. They are not simply structured through hard work and education. And this is again the work that I've been doing on caste, and that's why caste continues to be significant, because if you look at top-end corporate jobs, they are not given to everyone, just on the basis of your qualification. The biggest qualification that you require, apart from other things, obviously, is your cultural skills, is your ability to present yourself as someone belonging to a particular kind of cultural background. So in that sense, being rural is not sufficiently dignified any longer. And this is a site of indignity which has become very, very critical. So my last point is to kind of think of some more empirical examples, is that, if you look at people living in villages, how has it become a kind of identity of indignity, is because of urban aspirations. I remember, how did it come about? I have done many studies in Northwest India, and sometime in the late 90s, early years of this century, I began to feel, that young people in villages, they were kind of getting alienated from their own families. People who were children of big landowners, their families also began to invest in their education. And if you go to a village of Punjab today, or even of other parts of India, almost everywhere, those who are slightly prosperous in the village, they'll send their children to English medium school. And if you're slightly more prosperous, you would also make sure that your child studies in the town, studies in the city. And you have many villages where buses will come in the morning, like they come to JNU, and will pick up kids and take them to English medium schools in the cities. So there is this urban aspiration, not that they do very well in life. They don't do as well as the children of the so-called urban upper caste do. So there is a new kind of urban aspiration, and this urban aspiration does not really get realized into urban achievements. Those mobilities don't happen. My second example is the question of farmer suicide is also very closely related to the question of dignity, in the sense that, with the kind of capitalist agriculture which is inevitable at one level, proletarianization is inevitable at some level, because it is capitalist agriculture, they get indebted, but this is a question of, patriarchal caste hierarchy, that the men, it's mostly the men who kill themselves, they also feel very humiliated when they are indebted. Invariably, the person who kills himself would have some agricultural land, otherwise they are not able to raise loan. Somebody has even 2 acres of land, right? 2 acres of land today anywhere in India would be worth at least 50 lakh rupees. And invariably the loan that is outstanding would be 5 lakhs, 7 lakh, 2 lakhs, maximum 10 lakhs. They can easily dispose of their asset and kind of stay alive and still have some money with themselves. Instead of doing that, they choose to commit suicide. And this is again a question of dignity, where your kinship network has broken. There are many other things that have happened. And this is something that people working on farmer suicide have not really worked as much as they needed to. The question of dignity, how do we operationalize the idea of dignity? And people who kill themselves, how they feel undignified. And finally is also the point that I was making, that how does one think about dignity in relation to the churnings that are happening in caste system. And this is not something that is happening only one way. Yes, there are Dalit mobilities, occasional Dalit mobilities. There are also so-called other backward classes who are also mobilizing their ascription. See, ascription is not simply static. Ascription is not simply being left behind. Ascription can also be agential, and we have seen, and that's where a question of dignity is also a political question. Apart from being a question for political scientists, it's also a question around which people mobilize. And those agential processes of caste mobilization are also producing a lot of churning. And this churning can again have many dimensions, and this is something that I think we need to empirically operationalize. Given the time limitations, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.